Welcome to the Organ Podcast from the Royal College of Organists with me, Mark O'Brien. In a moment, I'll be talking to Richard McVeigh about the extraordinary success of his YouTube channel, Beauty in Sound.
If you were to present an idea to management to say, I've got a really good idea, how about I just play hymns online on a Sunday night with no words or anything, it's just me playing hymns, you would be told, no, that's ridiculous, that will never work.
I go on a job with organ advisor William McVicker to get a glimpse into the complex world of being an organ consultant.
I can think of a cathedral where they wanted to put a big new organ in, but nobody had asked the question, well, how much does it weigh? And if you put something weighing between 20 and 30 tons on the wall of a cathedral, how does it stay there?
And I meet one of the UK's most established and influential organ teachers, Marsden Thomas.
I was poorly taught, frankly. Organ teaching and indeed organ playing was at pretty low ebb when I was growing up. And I found I liked teaching, and of course I also liked playing. And so I found that there was a space there where work needed to be done.
This is Richard McVeigh playing a new composition called This Shining Night, written by 19-year-old Christopher Churcher. It's one of a number of pieces from a new book of organ music called Veni Creator, which Richard has compiled and published following a competition he held on his YouTube channel Beauty in Sound, inviting his followers from all over the world to submit compositions for the organ. Well, Richard has achieved extraordinary global success by streaming himself playing live on his Hauptwerk organ and making recordings of some of the great cathedral organs in the UK. In some cases, reaching audiences of up to 1.6 million people. Well, I went to meet Richard to find out how he manages to do this from his home in Winchester. Now, Richard, I suspect there aren't many organists who won't have watched you on YouTube performing where we are right now, in your front room, in front of your Hauptwerk organ, which is a huge 4-manual instrument. This would look very much at home in a cathedral organ loft, but we've got cameras all around the room and speakers all around the room as well. Where did this start?
I think that the best ideas in life, they come from something else. So I didn't set out all those years ago to live stream on the internet and then make something of it. It just happened. I tried live streaming because live streaming on YouTube was quite a new thing back in 2018, 2019. No one was doing it in the organ world. In fact, very few people were doing it in the music world. And certainly the only people live streaming were gaming enthusiasts, people playing games online. I'm being a bit of a geek, and I must confess that I do subscribe to some gaming channels. Had the idea of, well, if they can stream, well, why can't I stream? So I tried it, and it was rather fun. The numbers were very low. I was quite happy to get over, double figures watching. But then that planted the seed, if you like, into this is something which could work. This is something that people are engaging with, because every time I did it, numbers went up and the feedback was very strong. So then that morphed into a weekly broadcast on a Sunday, which is where we are now, where we get 5, 6, 7, 8, 10,000 people watching in the course of a week.
But despite your success, presumably there are still a lot of people who are rather sniffy about Hauptwerk and electric organs. Why do you think that is?
I do think that in 2024, people are still being sniffy, and I actually do think it's a shame, because the organ, for me at least, is an instrument which elevates music within the liturgy. So the organ is deeply rooted in the church. I think the music in the liturgy can bring something that words and scripture alone cannot. The music really elevates a service. An organ in a church is not there as a museum piece of engineering. So I think there are two camps that I can think of organists. You have organists who play the organ for the music, whether that be repertoire or for liturgical music, or you have organists who are interested in the engineering of it, how they're built, how it looks fantastic and it sounds glorious, and a lot of engineering has gone into that. And I think the people who are into the more engineering side of the organs are the people, dare I say it, who are a little bit sniffy, as you say, about the electric digital organs. I think there is space in the world for both these types of organ. I do love the engineering, just the whole heritage of a pipe organ, because I was brought up in the pipe organ world. But these electric organs, I think, are fantastic particularly for home use, for practicing at home. And at venues, a concert hall that doesn't have a pipe organ, these organs can step in to fill that gap.
I mean, admittedly, you've got a very impressive setup here, but you've had some big names coming around to perform on this who have streamed on your YouTube channel, people like Colin Walsh, Martin Baker, you've had Anna Lapwood, and loads of other people. What was their reaction when they played this?
I think a positive one. I don't want to speak on their behalf, but I think that they were all surprised, I think is the word that I would use, when they played and heard this organ. It was designed so that when the organist sits at the console, they have no indication that it is not a real organ. There's no hint of anything digital about it. It looks and feels like, one of our great cathedral organs. And it really sounds like it in here as well.
Well, can we hear it? Because I think most people are used to listening to you on YouTube. So I know that you just played direct into the YouTube channel. But I'm interested to know how this sounds physically standing in your room. I mean, have you got a sample loaded up that you can play it now so I can actually hear what it sounds like in this room?
Well, as luck would have it, yes, we have the organ of Dudelange loaded up. It's one of my favourite sample sets. It's a glorious 4-manual organ in Luxembourg, which has everything on it you could possibly want, including this rather glorious tuba moralibus. And then we have glorious chamades up on the top manual, which are extreme.
I mean, it's fascinating because you've got speakers all around, so the sound is coming from behind me and all around. I mean, yes, I'm not quite in the building, but yeah, you are immersed in something that's different.
One of the glorious things about these sample sets is the acoustic of the building is as important as the actual pipes. So you do hear the real acoustic. When you play a big chord and release it, you are in the acoustic for maybe 5, 6 or 7 seconds.
Do you find you've spoilt yourself? Because in a way, this is so perfect, it's so clean, it's so convenient that you actually enjoy this more than having to go and play on a mechanical pipe organ.
I think there is a danger of that. I do feel very fortunate to have access to this. And it's one of the reasons why I'm very keen to promote it, to invite people to come and play it, and particularly people who might not have experienced something like this. So yes, the answer to your question, I think, is yes, I am spoiled here. It's the organ, I think, sounds almost too perfect. If you imagine listening to a CD of a well-recorded organ, but actually playing that CD live under your fingers, that's what you are experiencing with this. So in a way, you actually are able to hear the organ better than you are in real life.
But I guess in the digital world we're in now, with social media, with streaming, with YouTube, this kind of design for an organ is probably best suited for it than perhaps any other musical instrument. So going back to your channel, because of this, you are reaching tens of thousands of people. Has it surprised you the sheer number of people who are engaged with the organ, let alone what you're doing with it?
It surprises me every week, Mark. It really does. I mean, I sit down here on a Sunday night and click the go live button, and I am astonished by the amount of people. And of course, I'm very grateful for the amount of people who tune in. But it really surprises me that people keep coming back for something that I never really thought would be that interesting. You know, a guy playing hymns and waffling live online on a Sunday night for anything between 2 and 3 hours, like you say.
What is the appeal, do you think, to that?
I don't know. What do people come for? I think if you were to present an idea to management to say, I've got a really good idea, how about I just play hymns online on a Sunday night with no words or anything, it's just me playing hymns, you would be told to, no, that's ridiculous, that will never work. But it works. And I think what it is, it's somehow the informality of it. It's a personal experience. So all of the hymns and all of the music that I present on a Sunday or any other day really has all been requested by the audience. And I think that's what makes it so popular. It's designed by them. It's the interaction as well, actually. The interaction is really, I think, a key point of its success. It's live, and I'm able to respond to people watching live, engaging with them, answering questions as we go along, responding to what they're saying in the live chat. And that is something that you can't get in a real venue, I think. And that's what makes it so unique and so, I think, so successful.
And because you do this on YouTube, do you have the technology to find out where you're most popular in terms of countries in the world?
Yes, so the analytics are devastatingly honest and open. I can see demographics, I can see where people are in the world, I can see gender, I can see age. You know, I can really drill down. And I think the art of building a successful YouTube channel is taking those analytics very seriously and seeing what is working. Most of my audience is in America and in Canada. And then it comes over to Europe, you know, to the UK and then to Germany and France. And the Netherlands is one of my biggest audiences as well.
I mean, that's a fascinating tool in terms of then working out the appeal of the instrument in the repertoire. And I guess for you then, largely that is hymns.
It seems to be, yeah, which I would have never have planned that. I do see also a separation of people who come for the hymns only. There are some people who will rarely come for the pipe organ concert recordings, but then there's a good few people who actually come to everything and just consume it all.
Do you get stressed over the viewing figures because they're so explicit? Do you sort of do something and then you panic because, you know, this afternoon you only got 7,000 people watching you, whereas, you know, last week there were 12,000?
Oh my goodness. So this is why I think I'm losing my hair, because it is so stressful. It's, you know, it's sort of like, this is a job for me. And it's almost like having a report on every piece of work that I do, whether it being a virtual church, a recording, or anything online. It's a piece of work, basically. And the analytics, the figures, is like an immediate grade. You know, it could be an F, or you might get a C on your homework, or you might get an A star. You never quite know what you're going to get, and that is stressful. But it's also very surprising because some things will do very well, which didn't expect to do very well, or indeed things that I have spent weeks preparing don't always do quite so well. So it's the more informal, amateur type videos, I think, which are the more successful videos in a funny way. And why that is, I don't know. And if I knew why that was, I think I would be maybe 200,000 subscribers.
But is this the future? I mean, for young organists, what you've demonstrated is with social media, with the organ in its electronic format, there is a new legitimate career. And presumably, you probably won't want to go into too much detail, but a profitable career that you can now do on the organ. Is this perhaps where it's going, where other outlets for this instrument perhaps are receding?
I wouldn't particularly say that this is where it's going, but I would say that this is a new emerging market. There's a new opportunity, I think, for organists who are willing to put themselves online, warts and all. That's one of the crucial things. A lot of people in the music industry are very precious about the way they are presented online. They will only release a recording of themselves if it is absolutely perfect. When in my early days of doing online work, that was me. I was very, very careful about everything I put online. I'm less now concerned about, particularly when I'm playing, and I also try to encourage this on the organists that I'm recording, we don't try to go for such a polished performance, but we go for a live performance, which has something more about it than a polished performance. So I think anyone coming into this new market will have to some extent, let down their own personal guard and, have a personality. I think that really helps. I think that's actually a bit more important than playing the right note.
But is there a risk here because of the way people consume social media and a young emerging audience and young players coming on? Is there the risk that in order to be noticed on social media, you're asking the organ to do different things? You might want to be quirky. You might not actually be very good. You might be selling yourself as the personality. And therefore, perhaps the organ slightly becomes trivialized to a sidepost, or it becomes something that, like everything else, you scroll through. Is there a danger you saturate this and the organ actually loses its artistic, its creative standard?
No, I don't think so at all, actually. I think the organ is there for many people. It shouldn't be elitist. Everyone has a right to play it and to enjoy it in whatever way they want to enjoy it. I love going to hear, some of our great organists in the world. My favourite organists, and I have many, but some that spring to mind. David Briggs, who's a friend of mine, Olivier Latry, Nathan Laub. These wonderful, wonderful organists. They really inspire me. But then I know that I can't play to that level. I never pretend to play to that level, but I know what I can do. I can play to my own level with repertoire, and I can play hymns in a certain way, which I think people enjoy.
But it's about aspiration. That's what I'm getting at. If people are looking at the organ and they're not made aware of the full extent of its potential because of how it gets packaged on social media, that you miss out on the aspiration of being aware of the Nathan Laubs and the Olivier Latry.
Aha, well, this is where BIS, I think, specialises. So I think we have a level of excellence here at BIS. I hope I can say that. Particularly, I think, when it comes to BIS recording other people, particularly when we go out in the real world to record pipe organs, I present them in a way which I think is industry standard. And also when people come to play the BIS organ live, those are like high quality outputs in terms of performance. I think you'll not really hear many people playing better than those people that I've recorded. And I don't think there's a danger of the organ becoming sort of a throwaway thing that you might scroll past. I think there's something in it for everyone.
So really, from your point of view, despite the success and your identity being online, the real thing is still very much at the heart of what you do.
Pipe organs, absolutely. Because without pipe organs, we wouldn't have these sample sets. So these sample sets are standing on the shoulders of the pipe organ giants.
Richard McVeigh, thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
I'm in Bermondsey in southeast London on my way to meet William McVicker, who is one of the country's leading organ consultants. William is chair of the Association of Independent Organ Advisors, a professor of organology at the Royal Academy of Music, and curator of the organ at the Royal Festival Hall. And in addition to all of this, he's been organ advisor to the restoration and rebuild of many of the major cathedrals, churches and town hall organs throughout the UK. And right now, He's just across the road here in the Church of St Mary Magdalene, where he's carrying out an assessment on a small 2-manual historic pipe organ. Well, I'm hoping to find out a bit more about the role of an organ advisor and some of the responsibilities that come with it.
Rather excitingly, we are literally treading the steps that Jeremiah Clarke and John Blow would have trodden, and Renatus Harris.
What, in this church?
In this church, in this very walkway that we've just come across now, because there was an organ built here by Christian Smith in 1698, probably finished 1699. He was the nephew of Father Smith, the famous Father Smith, but he wasn't as successful an organ builder. There was a court case about the organ, and they called some expert witnesses, Jeremiah Clarke, John Blow, and Renatus Harris, to come and write reports, I think, on what was wrong with the Smith organ in this church. And it resulted in the court case, and quite soon afterwards the organ was replaced. As I said, Christian Smith wasn't the organ builder that his relation was, but we have got this extremely interesting case with its cherubs on. It's clearly an old case, but nobody quite knows when it arrived here. It says quite proudly on the organ case here, just on here, it says 1751 Christopher Schreider. Now, he was organ builder to the king. Looking at the case, you can see there's all sorts of alterations. We've got this rather unkind grill work, which has been added here in sort of loudspeaker material. Yeah. And we've got these rather antique-looking case pipes. But if we investigate a bit further and just make a bit of a...
You're hitting the pipes in the case.
I can tell that these are zinc. So they are lacquered and they're modern.
Just by tapping them, you can tell they're made of zinc and they're modern.
Yeah, they probably date from the Manda rebuild in the 50s. And in those days, people would have replaced them because they looked old and battered. Now, I think people would go the extra mile to try and restore them and look after them. But you can usually tell by tapping them whether, that's a rather zinky sound. But if it was lead tin, you'd get a much darker, lower pitch sound than that, rather.
That's really interesting.
So, and they're in very pristine condition as well, and you wouldn't quite expect that on an organ of this age.
But what's going through your head, because as historically interesting as this organ might be, you're here with a purpose, and I suppose this is similar to what you do all over the country when churches, organists want to know what to do, whether it's a restoration job, whether they're going to rebuild it, whether they're going to add to it. So what's your thinking? What are you trying to work out today on this job in this church?
Well, understanding the organ's history is going to be paramount in a place like this. You have to give the organ some kind of historic value, because that might well unlock the door to some grants. There are some grants around for historic instruments, but if an organ has been too significantly altered, then the trustees or the grant awarding body aren't so interested in giving money for that. And of course, there's a separate question is, well, it could be funded, but what is actually going to be the scope of work that an organ builder would undertake? And I think an organ advisor would set out in broad details what a series of organ builders would tender to. If you ask an organ builder to come and have a look at an organ, they will look at it in their own terms and make their own suggestions. But the next organ builder that comes along may have a different view, and they would look at it. And then you've got two tenders which don't match each other. And if the parish wants to say, OK, so we've asked the organ builders to do this work, but the tenders are too complex to unpick, without telling an organ builder how to do it and what to do, there's a value in saying these are the broad brush principles that we want you to follow in restoration or rebuilding of this organ. And then the tenders can be evaluated much more clearly for the parish and the PCC to understand and make a decision as to who their preferred bidder would be.
So you're giving the guiding principle, that the overall flavour for which the organ builders can work.
Yeah.
But, do you get on? You must know all the organ builders of this country. But is there sometimes friction? Because, you might have an organ builder with a particular idea, a tonal idea in mind, or you might have a parish, the clergy or the organists who have a particular tonal or performance ideal in mind, whether that's actually the pastoral direction of the church. And suddenly they're being told, well, no, you can't go in this direction because your organ is historic or it's not mechanically capable of doing that. Are those sort of common areas of friction you encounter?
Oh, definitely. I know quite a lot of organ builders in the British organ building trade. Some of them would definitely roll their eyes if they knew that the consultant was involved. And I think some of them sometimes say, what does a consultant actually bring to a project? And I think by the time an organ builder arrives on a project, quite often there's been a huge amount of spade work done, the research, the understanding of the instrument, talking with the parish, trying to convince them or get them to understand the historicity of what they've got, the value of it, and helping them get it onto a position in their agenda where they're prepared to fund it. There is a huge element of diplomacy involved in organ advisory work, because you can't wade in and just say, you've got to do this by law. You've got to help the parish to understand that there are processes, legal processes, the faculty jurisdiction system. In cathedrals, it's called the cathedrals measure, and these are regulated, and they are parallel legal tracks.
So in theory, a church or a cathedral can't actually throw any organ out without due process.
Well, some do, and then
they shouldn't. Basically, they're not supposed to.
Yes, and then they get into trouble afterwards,
which is too late.
But one would hope that both churches and organ advisors and parishes can come to understand the value of the heritage that they have received.
But is it always about history? I mean, where does the element say, you just have a very bad, or it could be a very good, a 1960s job or a 1950s job? Now we're into the realms, presumably the subjectivity of tonal colour and character. When you're listening to an organ, what are you looking for to say, yes, this sounds nice, you should keep it, no, the scrap heap's the best place for this, go and get a brand new one?
Yeah, well, you've touched on a huge subject, and actually for the last 20 years I've been writing a book, and it's sort of about this, and it's to do with how music and organ building have interacted over the years. What has given rise to a certain way of building. And you mentioned a 1960s organ. Well, we're very aware of neoclassicism, which waded in and added mutations and mixtures to organs that really didn't need them, or that when you hear those stops, they're real foreigners to the organ building style. And what I wanted to try and look at was, well, if an organ builder had built an organ, what was really in their mind when they built it, when they scaled it, when they voiced it? What were they trying to do musically? What were the influences which made them go in a particular direction? But an organ that was made in 1960 is just as valuable as one made in 1751. It just has a completely different musical accent.
But that's the problem again, because aren't we if we made an architectural comparison, I hope I don't get shot for this, but would a 1960s organ be the equivalent of a brutalist concrete tower block that nobody likes, but because it's of its kind, you have to keep it? Whereas there would be a beautiful, Georgian arcade, architecturally stunning. Are we losing track of actually the tonal quality rather than just, here's a representation of a particular period in time?
So the question you're really asking here is, how do you evaluate quality? And that's a very difficult thing to answer, because the quality of sound of an instrument, an old instrument, is very different to a modern neoclassical spitting organ, which has its own kind of guttural characteristics. But it was made in a very particular way to speak in a particular way, and it has a homogeneity and a wholeness to it. And if we go through our history altering everything that we find, we're not actually going to have examples of other things. And the question is, are those examples that survive, do they have a value? Are they actually really interesting? Are they at the service of the music? And I think it's often in organ advisory work, it's a question of trying to see the bigger picture and trying to write something which helps the parish get its thinking organised, because in the end, the organ is not a plaything for an organist to fiddle with. They are there temporarily to make music in that place on an instrument which was built for, at a time and a place. And as long as the church is served by that and served well, the church, the PCC, needs to make the decision as to what it wants to do. And it sometimes needs professional advice to help it see what that bigger picture is.
So your role then, advisor, just the physical instrument is only part of the story then, really. This is why
I think so.
you are needed.
There's a connectivity with the rest of the fabric, and quite often you need to have the architect involved, a structural engineer. I can think of a cathedral where they wanted to put a big new organ in, but nobody had asked the question, well, how much does it weigh? And if you put something weighing between 20 and 30 tons on the wall of a cathedral, how does it stay there? It's got to have an equal and opposite force to balance it. And where there's no triforium or clerestory, that means 3 concrete blocks on the outside of the building. And if there's no continuity of thinking, you can get into a deep mess talking about how many reed stops it's got and how many flutes and all, but without even thinking, well, where's the blower going? Does the dean and chapter know anything about the project?
About to destroy the east wall. Well, let's get back to the organ in hand. So we're in St Mary Magdalene, Bermondsey. We've switched the organ on. You're sitting at it. What are you now looking for to come away from here with a clearer idea of what needs to be done?
Well, there are a couple of things. First of all, there's a certain amount of archival research which needs to be done to help clarify, because it says here on this label, it says 1751, but another source says 1710. In itself, this case is a magnificent piece of work, and it's got to be looked after. There's no question about that. That's a furnishing.
So you'd instantly say, we'd keep this, even if I discover what's inside isn't worth much.
And then we've got the question of, well, what is inside? And we happen to know here, it says rebuilt by James Walker, 1851. Well, we know that's not right either, because it's 1853. It's a C compass organ.
So it means that the keyboard starts at bottom C rather than F or G that older organs used to have.
That's right, but if we go to the swell organ here we are, start at middle C, we get to tenor C, but there ain't nout below that.
Oh, right.
Because this is at a period of English organ building when, the Georgian organ had come out of a situation where previously it had been middle C, the compass, and then it had been tenor G, fiddle G, and then it had gone down to tenor C. But those notes weren't really needed because the swell was providing colour, right-hand solo colour. So this is a kind of in-between organ in this period, 1853, where it's still got Georgian characteristics.
But interesting then, I mean, that again points to its authenticity, that nobody's bothered to fill that in. So here we are in 2024.
Well, in order to answer that question as to whether somebody would fill it in, we're going to have to go and look in the back and see, how it was constructed.
But what you are teaching me is never to believe the plaques that are on the organ then, because there's beautifully calligraphy, a name, a plate on it, but all the dates are wrong, according to you.
I began by saying, there's great value in archival research, and if you believe everything that you read, you have to question these things and have complete bibliographic control. That's what somebody taught me.
Right, well, let's go and have a look inside.
Here's the doorway for the entry into the organ. I'm going to go in first here. I've already switched the light on. But if you can come in just a little bit closer, because we're going to have a look in the swell box in a minute. But I think you can immediately see here, there's the giant pendulum of the clock in the tower, which is hanging there. And then there's a ladder here which goes up and it walks across the top of the swell box.
You have to stand on the swell box.
Yeah, and actually I'm not going to do that because you've no idea whether you're going to go through
that would be the end of you and the end of the swell box.
Yeah. And the other thing you can see is that you can't get into this organ. It's not unusual for Victorian organs to be built from the corner out. And when you want to fix something, or you say to an organ builder, can you fix bottom C sharp of the board on, which doesn't work? They said, well, it hasn't worked since 1930, because you can't get in there.
Now, explain that. Is that an actual thing, building from the corner out?
Well, I think they had supreme confidence in what they were doing when they built it.
They built it to last. They built it without anybody going in to fix it.
Yeah. So this, if you wanted to send somebody in to maintain this organ, you might send somebody in the size of a chimney sweep.
A child, basically.
Well, and if the chimney sweep never came out, you just send another one in. So you could see that the actual amount of space here in the organ is extremely limited to do any work. And that's probably one of the things that just saved it.
Right.
We saw at the console that it had a tenor C swell, and a modern organist would say, well, it's missing all its bottom. Well, where would they go?
There's no room.
There is no room in here to do that, and I'm sure that other organists have asked over the years, "Oh, can't we have a bottom octave for the diapason?" And the bottom line is, well, there isn't room to do
Where would you
it.
put it?
Yeah.
So, I mean, are you thinking if this is going to be restored that you would redesign the shape to make it accessible, or do you have to keep it like this and, think like a Victorian and hope it'll last another 100 years?
Well, these are questions whether you should do it, or, the organ has made it all the way through history this far without its bottom octave of the swell. People may have missed it, but it doesn't stop music making going on here. And if the organ is going to get some grant aid, the grant funders are more likely to be interested in helping preserve the organ into the future than they are in undertaking further alterations. And I think it's the duty of the organ advisors to point these things out, not to come up with a scope of work which says you have to modernise this, but to put the options out before a PCC so that they understand really clearly that there may be grants available for retaining it. And you may also come across an organist who's absolutely determined to have the bottom octave fitted, and there may be good reasons. Our musical tradition demands that we have this bottom octave.
And what would it be? I mean, what would your position be, say, for this organ? Say the organist, so we're making this up now, but for this type of organ, they wanted an electric action with a capture system and pistons.
Well, you would then be throwing away a huge amount of material which could be restored and put back into perfect working order. Now, an organist might want that, but a PCC may need to be given the picture, which is, if you restore it, it'll go on for another 100 years, and it's, as it's come through history already. And if you electrify it, well, electronic components just don't last forever. I mean, it's the same kind of technology as you have in a laptop, and who has a laptop for 20 years? What is the life expectancy of these digital systems? So I think one needs to lay out the reality that if you restore this organ as it stands now, the likelihood is the mechanisms are robust enough to go on for another 100 years or more. But if you put a digital system in, change the stop action, put solenoids in, they will all need to be done again, but 30 to 50 years time. Well, maybe that's enough time to make music in that, but you will then have foreshortened its life and thrown away what is important and valuable historic material.
Tricky. It's a really tricky decision.
It's very hard, and I think coming back
but
to
people do get very passionate about these discussions. And
Yeah,
it's almost like talking about Brexit sometimes. So there are very heated passions when it comes to the sound and the mechanical alteration of instruments.
Yeah, and I'm an organist too, and I know the value of having pistons and all the rest of it. But here we are in a place where the organ has come through the centuries this far, and it hasn't had those things because it doesn't need to have them at this current time. So these are the checks and balances one has to lay out in an independent report to give a parish the opportunity to make informed decisions about what they're going to do. So just in front of us here is the door to the swell box. I'm just going to take that off there, and if I step up, I can see here that there's a very, very narrow, let me just get one of these out, there's a very narrow scaled gamba here. Now, they didn't really start making these sorts of very narrow pipes. This is beautiful spotted metal. It's got a wooden roller on the mouth. Let's just have a blow. Nice stringy thin tone, slotted at the top. This tiny scale of pipe is definitely a kind of 1904 thing. This sort of very narrow scale only started to emerge in the 1890s, so I would put my money on that being a 1904 edition. And it's in a position on the soundboard which is very, very narrow, and that can only have been a 15. You know, in the 1850s they didn't really have string tone, certainly not the narrow scale that you're seeing there. So it's quite possible that that gamba is a useful addition. It's been there for well over a century already. Is it part of its history, or do you put it back to a 2-foot stop? I'm not going to answer that question because it'll, the parish hasn't made its own decisions about what it wants to do. But these are the sorts of questions that an organ advisor would be posing and suggesting answers for.
In a sense, do you kind of have an historic responsibility on your shoulders? Because are you, in a way, with the amount of advising you do, the number of organs that you've worked on up and down this country, you are kind of curating a modern English sound?
Well, that's when you get a new organ to build, or when an organ is going to be largely recreated. So I can think of one or two jobs that I've got where there was an interference in the middle of the neoclassical period, which were not in the organ's best interests. And an organ which has a truly romantic heart was neoclassicised in a way. And I think that a very useful phrase to use is that some of these voices have not earned their keep. As a visiting organ advisor, I think it's dangerous territory to wander into a church or a cathedral and say, I don't like that coppel flute. It's just a foreigner on the organ. Because it might be the stop they use all the time in accompaniment. It might be one of the most useful voices on the organ. And so you have to interact with the musical staff there and come up with a judicious balance between what represents good quality organ building going forward, maintaining the integrity of an organ or restoring its integrity, and actually understanding the value of the alterations which have already been made to the organ. And there's that question, have those stops earned their keep?
Well, William, thank you ever so much for... I'm going to let you get on now because I can see you're half falling into the swell box, so I think we'll leave it there. But William McVicker, thank you ever so much indeed for your time and for giving me a glimpse into your work.
Been a great pleasure.
Anne Marsden Thomas is one of our most successful and influential organ teachers. Having written and edited well over 20 books of anthologies and playing technique, she's also the founder of the famous St Giles International Organ School at her church, St Giles Cripplegate, where she's been director of music for over 40 years. Having enjoyed a distinguished recital career, she's also well known for championing the role of women in the organ world, particularly by founding the Society of Women Organists in 2019. I met Anne recently, and I began by asking her why she's dedicated so much of her life to teaching the organ.
I was poorly taught, frankly. Organ teaching and indeed organ playing was at a pretty low ebb when I was growing up, and I found I liked teaching, and of course I also liked playing, and there was a market out there, and so I found always a ready supply of students and developed my skills, and so it's grown from there, really. And at the same time, of course, the resources for student organists were dreadfully old-fashioned, and so I found that there was a space there where work needed to be done.
But was there something in particular? I mean, you focus so much on teaching. There must have been something you realised that was missing. Is there inherently a bad technique for organ playing generally?
Yes, so many organists are never taught any technique. That's so shocking. It was true for me too. I spent 4 years at the Royal Academy of Music, and I had my FRCO, and I was never certain about my pedalling. So I then went to Dame Gillian Weir, and she put me onto the Germani pedalling tutor, and it was a revelation. It was such a joy to find out that how I was meant to use my knees, my ankles, my feet, and actually to break it down. And the rest of my education as a teacher really has come from watching students, seeing what works.
But a lot of the books, then, the tutorials that you've published or edited, you concentrate a lot at the beginner and the intermediate. Is that perhaps part of the problem you inherited as a teacher, that there was very little for organists to begin with? So in terms of establishing that technique, perhaps it was just assumed that that part was done by the piano. There hasn't really been this culture of an established organ technique for learning organists.
Well, there were tutor books around. Until fairly recently, they were tutor books which had been written decades ago, and the technique suited the music that was being played at that time, teaching people how to play legato, for example. But even in those old books, there was very little attention given to exactly how you hold your hands, the support you give with the rest of your body, addressing any potential tension, and particularly a real emphasis on pedal technique.
So what makes a good organ teacher?
I think a good organ teacher, first of all, needs to be empathetic, needs to be where the student is, to understand where the student is heading, discovering the students' goals, what they want to achieve, what they want to play, and then to empathise with their particular physical abilities, their challenges, how they hold their arms, their bodies, their neck, their chin, their knees, their feet, and so on, studying how the student moves. And then the lesson needs a structure, equipping the student for all the activities they're likely to face as organists, because organists are expected to be able to do so many things: improvise, transpose, read scores, read figured bass, and harmonise a melody. Whatever they're going to do, they'll need these skills. And then to teach the repertoire, breaking the repertoire down, choosing the right repertoire so that the student isn't intimidated by music that's too hard for them, and breaking down the challenges within the repertoire to make the music easier to learn, fun to learn, and showing the student how to practice as well.
In your teaching, would you insist people come to you with a sufficient piano technique, or would you start an organist from grade one, essentially, with their keyboard skills being learnt first and foremost at the organ console?
I have done that, and it's very occasionally been successful, chiefly because of the difficulty of access to the organ. Many students fall by the wayside if they start from scratch. So I prefer it if they've got a good piano technique, but a good piano technique is the crucial thing here. I've had so many beginners at the organ who claim to have a reasonable grade on the piano, but their technique needs so much attention that I rather wish they'd not had any piano training before, because there's so much for the poor things to unlearn.
But the organ, unlike any other musical instrument, has this preparatory instrument first, the piano. You don't need to learn the violin if you're going to play the cello. You wouldn't learn the trombone before you play the trumpet. So that's my issue. Why still for the organ do people have to go through the rite of passage on another instrument before they can enjoy the instrument that they want to play?
I quite agree. And if a student comes to me with exactly that argument, I'll say, great, let's start on the organ. Of course, you can learn almost everything you need to know if under a careful teacher. You can learn the technique that you need. And there's some lovely music you can play that's really simple and it works fine on the organ. But it's accessibility. Most people don't have easy access to a church, especially a good organ in a church. And churches tend to be cold and dark, and it's difficult for young people to get access because of child protection and insurance and so on. So that's chiefly why I say go and learn the piano first if you can, with a good teacher.
But you said right at the start of our conversation that you had a bad teacher. You know, it wasn't really going well for you. It sounds like you started the organ with a bad experience. Why did you keep going?
The music, absolutely. I think it was easy to just dismiss the standard of teaching of those years because most people who offered organ lessons had themselves been taught by amateurs, who perhaps themselves had been taught by amateurs. And so it really was a fairly depressing situation. I was encouraged to love the music. I was probably given the wrong music to play looking back for a beginner. But I mean, it was wonderful. It was heady stuff playing the organ, even the rather poor organ I remember that I had access to. But still the music and the sound carried me along.
So when you were, you'd had that book of pedal studies from Gillian Weir, you were at the Royal Academy.
Yeah.
For you as a young woman at that time, what were your opportunities?
I think I've never actually been ambitious, which might sound a bit surprising. When I left school, I didn't think I was good enough to be a musician. So I took some music diplomas because I wanted to carry on studying while I worked full time. And I did well at the diplomas and thought, this is a bit daft. I really do want to be a musician, even if I end up doing nothing but teaching grade 1 piano. So then I applied for the academy and my teachers encouraged me, put me in for more exams and so on. Everything went well. Recitals came my way. I found I enjoyed doing that. And so life has rather carried me along. I've never sat down and thought, right, I want to shake the world with my playing. I've just gone from one thing to another and enjoyed everything and found there was work to be done.
But you did seem to make a conscious decision just to stop the recital work. And at a point in your career, I mean, you were nowhere near needing to retire. You were, in a sense, in your prime. Why did you make that decision just to stop?
My job at St Giles Cripplegate as Director of Music has always been important to me. And the organ, the one organ at that time, was needing a lot of money spending on it, cleaning, refurbishment. So to cut a long story short, we established a fundraising committee. We decided to fundraise not just for the dreary job of cleaning the organ, but also for establishing 2 extra organs. My colleagues were working very hard on the fundraising committee. I felt I needed to work harder on it. So there was that. And there was also the fact that one thing that no one tells you when you're young, as I was growing older, so of course new generations were coming up, they needed the recital work. And I thought, well, I've done all that. Let's move on to a different stage of my life. The teaching is important. The teaching really needs to be done, and the writing of books. So I just decided to stop doing recitals, as it's hugely time-consuming and not particularly profitable doing recitals. So I thought, time to make a change.
So that work at St Giles, at that point in your life, you launched National Learn the Organ Year. And then really everything did change for you as a result of that.
After National Learn the Organ Year, it became clear that there were thousands, literally thousands of people who wanted organ lessons, and a fair number of teachers who wanted to teach them. And a good result of National Learn the Organ Year was that we had a structure for putting the 2 parties in touch with one another. But there weren't enough teachers to go round, and so I launched St Giles International Organ School. And gosh, we had lots of students immediately. So I recruited more teachers, and so it grew. And eventually, many years later, I moved it to the Royal College of Organists. I headed it for a while, and now Simon Williams has done a grand job of expanding it further.
Is there an Anne Marsden Thomas style of playing the organ? Have you sort of established your own technique that you see pupils now using?
1 or 2 features, which entertains me. Early on, I decided it was death to good technique to allow people to play pedals when it's pedal solos with their hands on the bench, because I saw white knuckles and tense shoulders and so on. So I immediately started saying, right, no hands on bench, pretend there are spikes on the bench. Either put your hands above your head, which helps you to establish the pivoting of the knees, or before that stage, put your hands on the key cheeks, the wooden blocks on the end of the lower manuals. And so all my students do that, have done it ever since. And there are certain things that I believe in very much, teaching students to play with their knees together and showing them how to pivot from one knee position to the other, playing with the fingers close to the keyboard. Nothing controversial here, but a lot of teachers, I think, perhaps don't give sufficient emphasis to that.
But I suppose with such an influence that you have of your own style of teaching with your own books and subsequently your pupils, former pupils teaching, you do have quite an influence over the shape of organ playing perhaps in this country, and a responsibility therefore.
Naturally, with the many years of experience, the hundreds of students I've taught, I feel passionately about certain principles of teaching. But I do want to say that I know that there are other styles, approaches to teaching, and I would never want to rubbish those. My only guiding principle is, if the technique works, great, do it. But also linked to that is, will the technique carry on working as the repertoire becomes more challenging? And is the student happy with the technique? So I can't help but teach the techniques that I have seen working, that gives the student comfort and which seem to guarantee an absence of pain and a continuing agility as they progress and as they grow older.
You mentioned Gillian Weir as being an influence on your learning the organ. But at that time, who were your role models as a woman learning the organ?
Well, Gillian Weir, of course. She was the shining star, proving it could be done, playing so wonderfully with such communication. Jennifer Bate was also, of course, a big name then. And there were others, but of course the organ world was still dominated by men. We remember the women's names, I think, because we've always been in the minority. There have been few enough of us to remember. But the men have always been the great players. And of course, wonderful. I greatly admired lots of the men.
But I suppose because you were, I can call you an establishment figure, really, in many ways, because of your teaching, you perhaps came into contact with more men in terms of committees and organisations. And I've heard you talk about this as the only woman in the room. That was quite difficult or challenging, was it?
It's difficult to, when you join a new committee, it's always difficult, isn't it, to find your particular niche, how you can make any sort of contribution, impact even. And if you're the only one of your gender, that's particularly challenging, I think. I've no complaints. I was on the RCO Council for many years and met wonderful people, and they were always very gracious to me. I do remember with a different group, not the RCO, there was an expectation that I'd be the one that made the tea and cleared it up afterwards. That was a long time ago, though. But when we started the Society of Women Organists, my goodness, the dynamic around the table was so different. Hard to identify exactly, but I think we women we rejoiced in being together. That was one thing. We all commented on the novelty of it, talking about the organ world amongst a group of entirely women. Yeah, I think some people commented on the fact that there's a tendency to listen more carefully. And I think that women tend to be, one shouldn't stereotype, but because of our lives, our bodies, we tend to be perhaps more practical than men. So I think we've always followed up a concern with an action. And I think we've been pretty lively, actually. In our 5 years, we speak on the 5th anniversary of SWO, and we have 500 members. So it's clearly meeting some sort of need.
Do you think the instrument appeals to men and women differently?
I'd like to say no, not at all. Why should it? But I do think women are raised differently from men. Men are encouraged to think more about engineering matters, shall we say, and women more artistic matters. I think even enlightened parents who struggle to bring up their children in a totally gender-neutral way find it's impossible. There's so much pressure outside, which, by the way, emphasises the fact that it's so important that women are out there as role models to encourage more women to take up the organ, because there's no reason at all why they can't play it, at least equally in standard with the men.
But do you still think there is still an impediment for girls in the access to the organ purely because of the church? It's much better now, of course, and in cathedrals, where traditionally they wouldn't have had the choral tradition, where they could just casually go up to the organ loft, as simple as that, and turn pages or see what the organist is doing. So any girl, any woman coming to the organ would not necessarily have that route. Do you think that had an impact of your generation? I mean, there were a lot of women who were prominent on the concert platform, probably because there wasn't much opportunity to go down into a structured church or cathedral route.
Yeah, there may be truth in that. But, and certainly the church has been a difficult area for women to work in the past. But of course, the much more powerful influence has been the schools, and that's still the case. If boys are lucky enough to go to a public school, then they are likely to find there's a chapel there and an organ teacher and facilities for practice. And girls' public schools tend not to have such benefits. Of course, the RCO is doing wonderful work putting organs into state schools. So let's see the impact of that as the years roll on. Let's hope so.
Is it actually still very difficult for young girls who are wanting to earn a living out of playing an instrument that they love?
I think the opportunities in churches and cathedrals are opening up, as far as I can tell. Most concert organists also do some teaching or have a job like a town hall organist. I can't imagine there's any particular prejudice against either of those fields. But I wonder if girls look at the career and prefer something more stable, being of, as I suspect, a slightly more practical turn of mind. They see the insecurity of earning at least half your income from concert work. Who knows where that will take them. I don't think it's any harder than it is for a man, but I think girls may not be choosing that option so much.
And who would you see as today's female role models for organists?
There's absolutely no doubt that Anna Lapwood is having the most massive impact. I notice with my young, especially female students, I say, who is your role model? And they immediately say Anna Lapwood. So congratulations to Anna, who's doing a fantastic job, I think, in making the organ cool for youngsters and putting herself out there.
And in terms of putting themselves out there, you're still doing that. You're still teaching. You're still at St Giles. You've got another book out. Where do you get your energy from?
Well, one thing follows another, really, in this world, doesn't it? I'm lucky enough still to have my good health, And I love the work, and there's so much still to be done, I think. And the students keep asking for lessons, and I'm delighted to give them. The church still employs me and seems happy with the music. So I'm here for, well, the next few weeks, and then let's just see.
Anne Marsden Thomas, thank you very much for your time.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much, Mark.
Well, that's it for now. Next time, I get Blackpool's Tower Ballroom all to myself as I meet the legend that is Phil Kelsall, who's been playing the mighty Wurlitzer organ there for nearly 50 years. And I explore the music of a little-known early English composer with the help of William Whitehead and a castle down on the Dorset coast. So until then, from me, Mark O'Brien, goodbye.